Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's narration, we shall be looking at the life and crimes of Keith William Zettlemoyer, a man who gained notoriety in Pennsylvania, USA, for all of the wrong reasons. Keith Zettlemoyer was born on June 4th, 1955 in Aberdeen, Maryland. He was the oldest and only boy born to William and Donna Zettlemoyer. As a young boy, he was terrified of the dark, a fear which stayed with him through his adult life. His parents doted upon their only son, and as a child he would often spend weekends with his grandparents in Sunbury, Pennsylvania, where they would fish in the Susquehanna River. Keith was a quiet and reserved child who became increasingly reserved as an adult. His grandfather referred to him as a mystery kid who was a loner and a bit of a wanderer, often choosing to go off camping in the mountains with his dog. Keith's parents divorced when he was in his teenage years, and he spent time living with both his mother in Smokehouse Lane in Shamokin Dam and his father in Camelot Village in Susquehanna, northeast of Harrisburg. Keith dropped out of school in the 11th grade at around the age of 16, and then he worked in a variety of jobs, but never stuck with any of them: janitor, security guard, cleaner, shop assistant, but his main passion was photography. He tried to pursue this as a career, picking up some work as a special events photographer at the Hummel's Wharf shopping complex. Keith married his childhood sweetheart, Robin Marks, but this marriage ended in divorce in 1978. The following year he asked his new girlfriend to marry him. She agreed, but when he went to pick her up for the elopement, she backed out, and weeks later she married someone else. With limited work as a photographer, he began struggling for money and found himself unable to keep up with the payments on his expensive photography equipment. Up until this point in his life, he had never been in any trouble with the law, but with mounting debts, he came up with a plan which he believed would solve his problems. In May 1980, Keith, together with a friend, Kenneth Kipple, carried out a robbery at the Radio Shack store where Keith had previously worked. At around 2 a.m. on Memorial Day morning, the pair entered the mall using keys that Keith had access to during his time working there. The mall custodian, Charles Fox, was bound and gagged during the robbery. Keith and Kenneth made off with around $2,000 worth of merchandise and $260 in cash. They took Charles' car to escape, which they later abandoned. A gun was used to threaten Charles, but was not fired during the course of the robbery. Although they got away with their crime for a while, Kenneth was caught when he tried to return the stolen equipment to a different Radio Shack store in order to attempt to get a refund. He soon named Keith as his accomplice, and Keith was arrested in connection with the robbery on the 3rd of July 1980. Bail was posted for Keith, whilst Kenneth remained in jail awaiting trial. The case against Keith partially relied upon a plea bargain which had been made by Kenneth, who agreed to testify against his accomplice. At the preliminary hearing, Kenneth decided at the last minute not to testify. Without his testimony, there was insufficient evidence to continue with the charges against Keith. The case was dismissed. However, just 10 minutes later, Kenneth had a second change of heart after talking to his family and once again agreed to testify against Keith. The police immediately arraigned Keith on the charges which had just been dropped. A new hearing was set for the 18th of July, whereupon Keith was ordered to stand trial for armed robbery, burglary, kidnap, unlawful restraint, theft, unauthorised use of a motor vehicle and a firearms violation. The trial was due to start in October 1980. After he was charged with the robbery, Keith became increasingly depressed. The local paper featured details of the arrest on the front page, and he became ever more withdrawn. He began to spend more and more time in his bedroom, always keeping the door locked. His mother described how he underwent a complete personality change. However, one person who he still talked to was a friend, Charles Devetsko, who he had worked with at Radio Shack. Keith met up with Charles and asked him for advice on how to fool a lie detector test, and also admitted that he had been responsible for the Radio Shack robbery. Knowing that the security guard, Charles Fox, had been treated badly during the course of the robbery, Charles Devetsko was appalled and, unknown to Keith, immediately informed the authorities. At a court date 10 days before Keith was due to go on trial, prosecutors, following the law, read out a list of potential witnesses while selecting jurors. This was to ensure that none of the witnesses were known to any of the jurors. It was at this point that Keith realised that his friend Charles was a witness for the prosecution. Keith once again retreated to the safety of his bedroom. He sealed all the windows and the crack under the door to prevent any light getting in. He told his mother that his deceased grandmother lived in a better world than him, and that his mother should not cry if he joined her. He gave his mother a tour of the neatly packed boxes in his room, which contained his tools and the thousands of dollars worth of photography equipment that debt collectors were chasing him about. His bills were neatly stacked in a pile with an explanation as to when each was due. He said, "If I don't make it, I want everything in the room to belong to you." He said he wanted the room to stay the way it was. He made me promise I wouldn't change anything in his room, his mother Donna recalled. She was terrified that her son was going to take his own life. However, after 4 days, Donna returned home from work and found Keith up and out of his room, cleaning up and getting dressed. He said that he was going to go and see his dad in Harrisburg. Donna didn't ask any questions. She was just so relieved that he had come out of his room. Keith borrowed Donna's grey 1967 Ford van and headed south towards Harrisburg. In the early hours of October the 13th, 1980, two consolidated railroad policemen, William Houts Jr. and Gregory Benedek, were out on patrol in an area along the old Pennsylvania main line when they heard two gunshots approximately 15 seconds apart. They hurried towards the sound that came from a nearby wooded area. They found Donna's van and heard rustling in the undergrowth. They demanded whoever was there to show themselves, and Keith emerged holding a flashlight in his left hand and a gun in his right. "What's the matter, guys? I'm out shooting rats," Keith said. "At 4 o'clock in the morning," the officers replied. "Yes, I do it all the time," Keith calmly replied. They told him to drop his weapon, which he did, and he was secured. After a short search, one of the officers found the body of 29-year-old Charles Devetsko. It was later established that he had been shot a total of 4 times, twice in the van, where 2 bullets had lodged in his neck. The wounds were serious, but not enough to kill him. Keith had then dragged him from the van into the woods and used a second gun to fire 2 more shots, both of which had pierced Charles's heart. He was declared dead at the scene at 4:55 a.m. The police seized both weapons and 2 pairs of handcuffs at the scene. Keith also had handcuff keys tucked under the front of his belt, as if he planned to use them if cuffed himself. He was transported to the police station, and by the time he arrived he seemed disoriented and out of it. He wasn't making sense, and the police were unable to get a coherent sentence out of him. He was dazed and just staring ahead. His blood was taken to establish if he was under the influence of drink or drugs, but these tests came back negative. Keith was seen by Joseph Mullen, a jail counsellor. Keith told Joseph that he had tried to take his own life, but then, as the meeting was ending, Keith told Joseph that he thought he had shot his own father. Keith was arraigned before Justice William J. Gardner Jr. that morning, and the judge reported that Keith was high, flying high, and noted that he appeared to have trouble following proceedings. Later that day, Charles's body was positively identified. He had a large bruise on the back of his head, which was consistent with being struck or falling onto a blunt object. His cause of death was from massive hemorrhaging from his heart. When Donna visited her son on the 16th of October, she said that he did not know where he was or why he was there. She described him as wild looking. Keith repeatedly asked his mother why he was in jail. She told him that he was accused of killing someone. He asked her where Charles was, and she told him that Charles was dead. He didn't believe her. A continuance was requested in the robbery case, with Keith's attorney stating that his client's condition at the time of his apprehension in Harrisburg was almost comatose, and that there was a strong possibility that he was in a drugged state of mind, and that any discussions had been fruitless due to his condition. They also requested a change of venue due to the publicity that the case had generated. Both motions were denied. At trial, Keith claimed that he could not remember where he was on the night of the robbery and spoke clearly without any signs of nervousness. He said that he had a well-paying job as a photographer and had no need to rob the store. Kenneth Kipple testified against Keith, saying that he had carried out Keith's wishes as he feared for his own safety. Keith was found guilty on 1 count each of robbery, criminal conspiracy, burglary, unlawful restraint, firearms violation, and unauthorised use of a motor vehicle. After various delays, the murder trial got underway in April 1981. At the trial, his defence team stated that "We are admitting that Keith Zettlemoyer did kill Charles Devetsko on October the 13th, but that doesn't mean there isn't a defence in this case." His public defender, Robert N. Tarman, went on to say that Keith had been suffering from diminished capacity, then explaining to the jury that diminished capacity is different from insanity, because someone with diminished capacity knows the difference between right and wrong, but is suffering from mental illness. Whilst the defence agreed that Keith should be punished to some degree, they did not feel that it should be to the full extent of the law, and were seeking a third-degree murder conviction. On the other hand, the district attorney was looking for a first-degree murder conviction and the death penalty, as they said that that would prove that Charles was murdered to prevent him from testifying in the robbery trial. They presented several witnesses who said that there had been no evidence of Keith exhibiting bizarre or unusual behaviour prior to the crime, and the officers who arrested him said that he appeared calm and collected after the shooting. The defence claimed that he had suffered from a mental disorder for many years, with the severity increasing dramatically in the lead up to October 1980, calling his illness severe depression with symptoms of paranoia and schizoid features. Keith's mother testified about the difficulties her son had faced in life and the changed behaviour in the lead up to the murder. A defence psychologist described Keith as a man who was so emotionally damaged that he could not fully judge his actions and that he had deficits in common sense. He said, "I found that Mr. Zettlemoyer is a spoilt brat who figured out how to get what he wanted, either directly or by manipulating or controlling the situation. And I believe that, faced with the number of stresses that he had to deal with that he could not cope with, he decompensated." However, the judge stated that diminished capacity is not an excuse for antisocial behaviour. It is not something that excuses someone that is spoiled or pampered, or someone who loses control or judgment under stress. Somebody who had a poor lifestyle is a loser in life. Somebody who reacts to stress by violence, that is not what we are talking about. The defence asked for a mistrial on the basis that the judge had prejudiced the jury by misrepresenting the defence's message. This was rejected, and after jury deliberations of just 45 minutes, Keith was convicted of first-degree murder. He would either be sentenced to death or life in prison. After the prosecution and defence made their cases, the jury deliberated for 3 hours before deciding that Keith should be sentenced to death. They determined that the killing of a potential witness outweighed any mitigating circumstances that could have reduced the sentence to life in prison. Killing a witness is a specific aggravated circumstance spelled out in the state's death penalty law. A juror in that case would later state that part of the panel's debate centred on the worry that if Keith received a life sentence, he could potentially one day be free to kill again. They therefore decided the only way forward was for him to be sentenced to death. However, the judge should have told them that, if they deadlocked over the death sentence, Keith would automatically get life in prison without the possibility of parole. This was an oversight by the judge in the case. In October 1981, Keith was back in front of the judge for the official declaration of sentence. The judge sentenced him to die in the electric chair and directed that the sentence be carried out in 180 days on April 21st, 1982. This would allow for the Supreme Court's automatic review of the sentence as required by Pennsylvania's death penalty law. The judge also wrote to the State Corrections Commission asking that the electric chair that had been dismantled 10 years earlier be reassembled. In addition, Keith was sentenced for between 8 and 24 years for the earlier robbery, and in a change of heart pleaded for mercy for Kenneth, the man who testified against him in that case, saying, "As I'm sure you know, in about 107 days I will sit on the electric chair. It is not necessary to hide anything or lie any longer. On behalf of Mr. Kenneth Kipple, I would like you to be lenient. It was me who coerced or convinced him to engage in that crime. He didn't want to do it, but I talked him into it. Take his sentence and tack it onto mine." The judge took this and the fact that Kenneth had testified against Keith into consideration and gave a jail sentence which would require Kenneth to serve less than a month for these charges. April 1982 came and went as the legal process of appeals continued. Over the years, Keith went through 13 appeals, was housed in 4 prisons, and 3 execution dates came and went. After spending 14 years on death row, Keith fired his lawyers and dropped his efforts to live. He begged the courts to let him die, saying that, "I see my execution as an end of suffering to my imprisonment, a blessed, merciful release from all these health symptoms that I'm constantly suffering with. I'm not the slightest bit interested in reopening my legal case with any new appeal issues, and that I was perfectly satisfied to be quietly and peacefully in a legal execution. I'm not crazy, I'm not loony. I understand perfectly what's going on with the execution and everything." During his time in prison, he rarely spoke and would hardly ever take his 1 hour of daily exercise time. He would only allow his parents to visit, and even then only twice a year. Due to changes in the law, Keith was due to be executed by lethal injection rather than the electric chair, something he believed would be more humane. However, lawyers for the Pennsylvania Post-Conviction Defender Organization argued that Keith was not mentally competent and was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. 3 psychiatrists assessed Keith and they concluded that he was sane. Even Aldona Devetsko, the mother of Keith's victim, argued that Keith should not face the death penalty because she was not only wholly opposed to it, but also believed that Keith was mentally ill and was not competent to be executed for the murder. On February the 28th, 1995, Governor Tom Ridge, who had made carrying out the death penalty a campaign issue, signed his first 3 death warrants. One of these warrants was for Keith, who was scheduled to be executed on May the 2nd, 1995. In a statement written in the hours leading up to the execution, Keith asked for forgiveness from the people. "I ask that the people of Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania please accept my 14 years of imprisonment and my execution now, as all of my debt to society paid in full," he said. Governor Ridge, who signed the execution warrant, issued a statement saying, "Nearly 15 years ago, Keith Zettlemoyer brutally murdered his friend, Charles Devetsko. May Keith Zettlemoyer's soul rest in peace. May the soul of Charles Devetsko now rest in peace." Despite Keith's wishes, last-minute efforts were still being made to stop the execution. The state Supreme Court rejected the final appeal for a stay of execution at about 9:45 p.m. on May the 2nd. After a last meal of 2 cheeseburgers, French fries, chocolate pudding and chocolate milk, Keith was executed by lethal injection at the State Correctional Institution, Rockview. He was pronounced dead at 10:25 p.m, about 10 minutes after the drugs began to be administered. Keith became the first person to be executed by the state of Pennsylvania since the resumption of the death penalty in 1976, and the first inmate put to death in Pennsylvania in 33 years. The previous person being Elmo Smith, who died in the electric chair in 1962 for the 1958 sex murder of 16-year-old Roxborough schoolgirl Marianne Teresa Mitchell. As Keith's execution was the first to take place in Pennsylvania for 33 years, as the date approached, the coverage of his crime and the controversy surrounding the death penalty took up many newspaper columns. The following article by a staff writer, Dennis B. Roddy, appeared in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette on the 23rd of April 1995, 9 days before Keith was executed. I've included it here as I found it a very interesting piece on the reality and logistics of the death penalty process at that time. In 9 days, a trio of strangers, chosen in secrecy, will arrive at the large white prison that sits on a hillside here. Shortly before 10 p.m, they will insert catheters into both of Keith Zettlemoyer's arms, pump poison into his veins, and kill him. They will each get $300 in cash and disappear until summoned again. Nobody is ever to know the names of the people assigned to dispatch the first convict to be executed in Pennsylvania since 1962. The mechanics of capital punishment in Pennsylvania involve a series of meticulous protocols shrouded in sometimes bizarre secrecy. Department of Corrections officials, for instance, won't say precisely what chemicals will be used for the state's first lethal injection, but they will say that the combination of drugs that will put Zettlemoyer into a deep sleep and then stop his heart costs somewhere between $300 and $400. The department fails to see what public purpose would be filled by identifying the chemical agents, said Ben Livengood, spokesman for the department. They want to anaesthetize the process. It makes it digestible. The ruse that it's a medical process, said Andrew Shubin, a state college lawyer and death penalty opponent. The execution chamber is now referred to by corrections officials as the injection room. The room is the same one in which 348 men and 2 women were executed in the state's electric chair between 1915, when Rockview opened, and 1962, when Elmo Smith of Montgomery County became the last person put to death in Pennsylvania by electrocution. The chair is now in storage with the state's Historical and Museum Commission. While state officials won't identify the chemicals, a 4-member contingent visited Huntsville, Texas in March to confer with officials there. Texas has been executing inmates by lethal injection since 1982 and has carried out more executions than any other state. Texas uses a barbiturate called sodium thiopental, followed by a paralyzing agent called pancuronium bromide, which stops a person's breathing. A third chemical, potassium chloride, is then injected into the IV line, stopping the heart. In Illinois, corrections officer Nick Howell watched as executioners used the same 3 chemicals to dispatch convicted murderers James Free and Hernando Williams and serial killer John Wayne Gacy. James Free gave out a snort or a snore. Hernando Williams did nothing. Gacy gave some sort of respiratory sound, he said. It took 6 to 7 minutes for the men to die. Pennsylvania changed its legal method of execution from electrocution to lethal injection in December 1990. Midway through the next year, corrections officials put 3 people under a retainer. $500 apiece annually to carry out the executions. They also get $150 each for mock execution drills. They are the same three who will get $300 apiece on May the 2nd for the first execution in 33 years. State officials will give few details about the execution team, except to say its members are neither prison employees nor doctors, and that they are technically qualified to insert IV tubes and administer drugs intravenously. Under Pennsylvania law, the only people other than physicians authorized to administer IV drugs are nurses, physicians' assistants, and paramedics. There are probably fewer than 5 people in the entire department who know their identities, Livingood says. The 3 are issued prison credentials with assumed names. When they go through mock execution training drills, the prison staff members who join them don't know their identities. They will be brought to the prison by a staff member who will pick them up at a predetermined location. From there, the team will go to the DW building, a squarish block structure that stands directly behind the grand white main prison building. DW stands for Deputy Warden, although staff, prisoners and lawyers alike also call it the Death Warrant Building. Zettlemoyer will be waiting in a second-floor cell. Officials won't say precisely when he will arrive from the State Correctional Institution at Pittsburgh. But when Florencio Roland was scheduled to die last month for a 1984 murder in Philadelphia, he was taken to Rockview at midday of his planned execution day. Prison neighbours say state troopers blocked off roads as the vehicle carrying Roland neared. Prisoners who worked the fields and orchards of the prison were locked down in their cells immediately after their evening meal. All approaches to the prison were sealed off at 6 p.m. the preceding night. Roland was saved by a court-ordered stay of execution. When Zettlemoyer arrives, he'll be fingerprinted to verify that the right man has arrived. Transfer documents will include a recent photograph. He will be asked if he would like to issue a final statement. He can write it down or dictate it. The condemned man will be taken to the second floor and put in one of 6 cells lining a hallway adjacent to the injection room. His only view will be a patch of sky visible in one of the windows on the other side of the hall behind a screen of bars. At some point on the afternoon of May the 2nd, prison officials will deliver a menu from the prison cafeteria for his final meal. The menu includes grilled steak, roast beef, a cheeseburger, fried chicken, things you'll expect to find on a menu, as Livingood puts it. No alcoholic drinks are permitted. Department-approved immediate family members will be allowed a final visit. One clergyman and the inmate's attorney will be allowed to visit as needed. Around 8:30 p.m, prison officials will give Zettlemoyer another chance to make a final statement. Shortly after 9:30 p.m, a team of prison staff members will wheel a metal hospital gurney to his cell. A series of straps will be used to hold him down. A separate team will stand by, Livingood said, if there's a need to do a cell extraction should the prisoner be uncooperative. Those who know Zettlemoyer say he's an utterly beaten down man, profoundly withdrawn and unlikely to fight. Larry Fitzgerald, a spokesman at Huntsville State Prison in Texas, has witnessed 5 lethal injection executions this year and said he had heard no stories of resistance. Prisoners are often remarkably cooperative. In those last 6 hours, the prisoners I have talked to and met are resigned to this thing, or are inquisitive about exactly what's going to happen, Fitzgerald said. In one instance, a prisoner with collapsed veins because of intravenous drug use pointed out good veins to the injection team. There have been glitches in the injection process, says a report by the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. In one, Ricky R. Rector, a brain-damaged convict put to death for killing a sheriff in Arkansas, moaned for 40 minutes as an injection team tried to locate a usable vein in his arms. Under Pennsylvania's protocols, Zettlemoyer will be wheeled down the hallway and into the injection room. The front of the gurney will be latched to the wall behind him. Both arms will be extended. crucifixion style, and 2 members of the injection team will take over. The third will be on hand as a backup. Team members will insert catheters into both arms and hook them to tubes running through the small opening between the 2-way mirror on the wall behind Zettlemoyer's head. On the other side are bags with a saline solution that will drip into the tubes. The injection team members will go into that small room, which previously housed the transformer for the electric chair, and watch through the mirror. Remaining in the injection room will be Robert W. Myers, Deputy Warden for Operations, and Harvey Yancey, the Major of the Guard, the prison's highest-ranking uniformed officer. Myers will stand at a black wall telephone near the gurney on an open telephone line to the office of Warden Joseph Mazurkiewicz. Mazurkiewicz will be on an open line to the office of Governor Ridge, who signed the execution order. On a shelf next to the telephone will be a microphone and a small intercom box linking the Deputy Warden by voice with the team in the injection room. Yancey will draw open a blue curtain, revealing a large glass window. Behind it will be the clergyman, 6 news reporters, and 6 reputable adult citizens selected by Mazurkiewicz, all seated in folding metal chairs. They will see Zettlemoyer's feet, which will point towards the window. His face will be visible on one of several mirrors set up to provide a view. He won't be asked to give any last words. At 10 p.m, barring word from Governor Ridge, one or both members of the execution team, it's up to them to decide, will insert a needle and syringe into one of the 2 IV lines and pump in the barbiturate. Moments later, they will add the paralyzer, then the heart stopper. What will it look like? It's kind of like watching someone go to sleep, Fitzgerald said. When the lungs collapse, he said, they make kind of a cough sound. By that point, the inmate's dead. And at that point, the Deputy Warden will summon a doctor who has been waiting in an adjacent room, forbidden by his Hippocratic Oath and Medical Society rules to participate physically in an execution. He will check for Zettlemoyer's heartbeat and pulse. If all has gone as planned, there will be none. He will look at a clock that hangs on the wall directly above Zettlemoyer's head and announce the hour. That's what he'll list on the state certificate, that 14 years, 6 months and 17 days after he killed Charles Devetsko, Keith Zettlemoyer is dead. So an amazing piece of writing there by journalist Dennis B. Roddy. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye.